"Sir, I need you to sit down, right now." The flight attendant's voice was a thin, brittle thing stretched to its breaking point by panic. She stood in the aisle of the Boeing 777, her arms held out as if to ward off a ghost. Harold Lawson, 83 years old, did not move. He remained standing, a small, still point in the swirling chaos of the cabin. His eyes, the color of a faded sky, were not on the flight attendant, but on the flickering emergency lights above her head. The man beside her, a federal air marshal in a rumpled suit, stepped forward. His face was a mask of strained authority. "You heard her, old man. Park it. This is a federal situation." His hand drifted instinctively toward the bulge under his jacket, a gesture meant to intimidate. Harold's gaze shifted, meeting the marshal's for a brief, unblinking moment. There was no fear in his eyes, only a deep, weary calm that seemed to unnerve the younger man even more. The situation had deteriorated quickly. A sharp, acrid smell of burning electronics, a sudden lurch, then a cascade of failures. The cabin lights flickered and died, replaced by the eerie orange glow of the emergency strips. The in-flight entertainment screens went black, but the most terrifying silence was the one from the cockpit. For 10 minutes the flight crew had been trying to raise the captain. Their increasingly frantic knocks on the reinforced door met with nothing. The plane was a ghost ship at 37,000 feet, and the passengers were beginning to come apart at the seams. A woman in the row behind Harold was openly sobbing. A businessman was shouting into a dead cell phone. The air was thick with the metallic taste of fear. The air marshal, whose name was Agent Fuller, seemed to believe that maintaining order meant asserting dominance over the one person who wasn't panicking. "I am not going to ask you again," Fuller said, his voice low and menacing. He took another step, invading Harold's personal space. "We have a possible cockpit breach or incapacitation. The last thing I need is some confused passenger wandering the aisle." Harold's voice, when it came, was raspy but clear, cutting through the ambient noise. "The transponder is off." Fuller blinked. "What?" "The plane's transponder. It's not broadcasting our position," Harold repeated, his gaze distant as if he were seeing something far beyond the walls of the fuselage. "And we've changed our vector. We're banking slightly southeast, away from our flight path to Chicago." Fuller's face tightened. The old man was either dangerously perceptive or dangerously delusional. He chose to believe the latter. "How could you possibly know that? Did you see that on your little movie screen before it went out? Sit down, now." Harold ignored him. He was listening to the engines, his head cocked at a slight angle. The pitch was wrong. The starboard engine was running rough, a subtle vibration that he could feel in the soles of his worn leather shoes. He had spent a lifetime learning the language of machines under stress, and this one was screaming. "The flight crew needs to seal the forward galley," Harold said, his voice taking on a quiet authority that brooked no argument. "The fire is in the main avionics bay, just below the cockpit floor. It's why they're not responding. They're likely already gone. The fumes would have been first." The flight attendant gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Fuller's face went from suspicion to outright hostility. "That's it. You're done," the marshal hissed. He reached out to grab Harold's arm. "You're creating a panic. You are a threat to the safety of this flight." Harold didn't flinch. He simply looked down at the hand that was about to grip his thin bicep. "Son," he said, his voice soft but weighted with an ancient gravity, "you have no idea what a threat to this flight looks like, but you will very soon if you don't let me help." The cabin shuddered again, more violently this time. A collective scream went up from the passengers. The plane was sick and the people in charge were just as lost as everyone else. Fuller saw the rising tide of hysteria in the cabin and realized that manhandling an elderly man might set off a full-blown riot. He let his hand drop, but his eyes promised a reckoning. He pointed a trembling finger at Harold. "You stay right there. Don't move. Don't speak," he ordered, before turning his attention to the rest of the cabin, trying to project a calm he did not feel. "Everyone, please remain calm. We are handling the situation." But no one was listening to him. They were watching Harold. They were watching the old man who stood unbowed in the aisle, a pillar of calm in a world that was tilting on its axis. He seemed to know things they didn't, and in their terror they clung to that small, impossible hope. Harold knew the fire would soon compromise the hydraulic lines that ran alongside the avionics bay. Once that happened, they wouldn't be a ghost ship anymore. They would be a coffin. Time was running out, and the only person standing in his way was a man who saw a problem, not a solution. Fuller continued his charade of control, barking orders at the flight attendants, who scurried about with a desperate, unfocused energy. He saw himself as the protector, the shield against the chaos. In his mind, Harold was just another variable to be managed, another civilian who didn't understand the rules. The old man's calm was an anomaly, an irritation. "What's with the watch?" Fuller sneered, noticing the object on Harold's wrist for the first time. It was an old, oversized chronograph, its steel case scarred and pitted, the leather band cracked with age. It looked like something out of a museum. "Your grandpa give you that? Maybe it can tell you what time we're all going to die." The jab was cruel, born of fear and frustration. Harold glanced down at the watch. Its face was a complex array of dials and hands, the crystal scratched from 1,000 impacts. He didn't see an antique. He saw the frantic, desperate glow of its phosphorescent hands in a smoke-filled cockpit, the only source of light as he wrestled with the controls of a crippled aircraft over hostile territory. He saw the face of his co-pilot, young and terrified, illuminated in that same faint green light for a split second before the world outside the canopy exploded in a flash of white. The watch was a relic of a day he had survived when he shouldn't have, a promise he had made to a man who didn't make it home. It was a reminder that he had faced down death before. He looked back at Fuller, his expression unchanged. The insult hadn't landed. It had simply evaporated against the sheer silent mass of his history. The plane dropped a few hundred feet in a pocket of turbulence, and another wave of screams washed through the cabin. The situation was now critical. The smoke was thicker, seeping from the seams around the cockpit door. The flight crew was useless, paralyzed by procedure and terror. Fuller was focused on the wrong threat. Harold knew that if they couldn't talk to someone on the ground, someone who understood the language of the sky, their final moments would be measured in minutes. His eyes scanned the cabin, not in panic, but with a methodical purpose. He was looking for a tool. He saw it when one of the flight attendants stumbled, her service satchel spilling its contents into the aisle. Among the packets of antiseptic wipes and miniature liquor bottles was a small handheld emergency radio, the kind they used for on-ground communications but with a range that was, in theory, line of sight to the ground. It was a straw, but it was the only straw they had. He moved. His speed was surprising for a man his age, a fluid economy of motion that spoke of long-forgotten training. He scooped up the radio before Fuller could even react. "What do you think you're doing?" Fuller yelled, lunging for him. But he was stopped. A young woman, a college student in a university sweatshirt, had instinctively put her leg out into the aisle. Fuller tripped, sprawling clumsily. "Sorry," she said, her voice laced with anything but apology. At the same time, a young man in an army uniform, a private first class on his way home, stood up and positioned himself between Fuller and Harold. He didn't say a word. He just stood there, a silent, solid barrier. He had seen the same thing the student had, a quiet competence in the old man that the blustering air marshal completely lacked. They had chosen their side. Fuller scrambled to his feet, his face purple with rage. "You are all under arrest. You are interfering with a federal agent." But his threats were empty. Harold had already turned away, the small radio in his hand. He was fumbling with the dials, his old fingers struggling with the small knobs. The army private leaned in. "Need help with that, sir?" "The guard frequency," Harold rasped, his eyes not leaving the device. 243 megahertz. It's a long shot. The young soldier's hands were swift and sure. He tuned the radio, the static hissing and crackling. He handed it back to Harold. "It's ready, sir." Harold lifted the radio to his lips. Fuller was trying to push past the soldier, shouting about regulations and prison time, but no one was listening. The entire cabin was silent, watching the old man with the radio. They were all holding their breath. Harold pressed the transmit button. His first words were lost in a burst of static. He tried again, his voice now a low, powerful command that seemed to come from another man, another lifetime. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is civilian flight 739er. Any military asset on guard. Do you copy?" He paused, listening to the static. Nothing. He took a breath and tried again, this time adding the 6 words that would change everything. "Requesting immediate assistance. This is Ugly 6. I repeat, Ugly 6 is on board and assuming command." The call went out into the vast, indifferent sky, a ghost calling out from a dying machine. At the Air Route Traffic Control Center in Aurora, Illinois, the world was an orderly series of green blips on dark screens. But one blip was missing. Flight 739 had vanished from their scopes 10 minutes ago, a ghost in the system. The phones were already ringing, a quiet panic building among the controllers. Then, on a speaker reserved for the emergency guard frequency, a voice cut through the static. It was weak, garbled. A junior controller barely registered it, ready to dismiss it as atmospheric noise. "Civilian Flight 739er, Ugly 6, on board and assuming command." The junior controller frowned. "Ugly 6. What is that, some kind of prank?" Behind him, A man stood up from his desk so quickly his chair shot backward and hit the wall. He was a senior supervisor, a retired Air Force colonel named Marks, a man who had seen and heard everything. His face, normally placid, was ashen. "Get me a fix on that transmission," Marks roared, his voice cutting across the entire control room. "Now, scramble the nearest alert fighters. Tell them it's a Nightingale event. I want 2 jets on that plane's wing 5 minutes ago." The room, which had been tense, exploded into a flurry of focused action. Controllers who had been staring helplessly at a blank space on their screen now had a purpose: a Nightingale event. Most of them didn't even know what that meant. It was a code so old, so deeply buried, it was practically a myth. Marks was already on a red phone, a direct line to NORAD. "This is Aurora Center. We have a Nightingale declaration. I repeat, a Nightingale declaration from callsign Ugly 6. The silence on the other end was profound. Then, a voice, a 2-star general, came on the line, sharp and clear. "Confirm callsign. Ugly 6, General." "Confirmed." Another pause. The general's voice was strained when he spoke again. "My God, is the file active?" Marks was already typing furiously at a terminal, his fingers flying across the keyboard, accessing a system he hadn't touched in 20 years. A file appeared. It was almost entirely blacked out with redaction marks, but 2 words were clear: Lawson, Harold, and below them, the call sign, Ugly 6. "File is active, General," Marks said, his voice trembling slightly. "It's him. It's Colonel Lawson. He's on that plane." The general's orders were immediate and absolute. The full weight of the United States military was now focused on a single point in the sky above the American Midwest. The legend was alive, and he needed help. Back on Flight 739, Air Marshal Fuller had finally shoved his way past the young soldier. He lunged for Harold, his face a mask of pure fury, his authority utterly shattered, and his fear now in complete control. "Give me the radio, old man," he snarled, his hand closing on Harold's shoulder. "I swear to God, I will put you in restraints. You are a danger to this aircraft. You're probably the cause of all this." This was his final desperate gambit. By labeling Harold the threat, he could reclaim some semblance of control. He was ready to physically tackle the 83-year-old man, to force him into a seat and cuff him. He was a man pushed past the edge of reason, his training and judgment consumed by the escalating crisis. The other passengers shouted in protest, but Fuller was beyond listening. He was committed to his fatal mistake, convinced he was the hero of the story. It was the last arrogant act of a man who had no idea his world was about to be turned upside down. It happened without a sound. One moment there was nothing but the gray, empty sky outside the passenger windows. The next they were there, 2 of them, sleek, angular shapes of impossible technology, appearing as if they had materialized out of the air itself. They were F-35 Lightning IIs, the most advanced fighter jets in the world. They weren't just near the plane, they were glued to its wings, their cockpits so close that the passengers could see the pilots inside, their helmeted heads perfectly still. A collective gasp went through the cabin. The raw, predatory beauty of the machines was terrifying and awe-inspiring. They slid through the air with a silent, deadly grace. The sight was so sudden, so overwhelming that it shocked the cabin into absolute silence. The sobbing stopped, the shouting died. Every eye was fixed on the military jets hanging in the air beside them. Fuller froze, his hand still on Harold's shoulder, his mouth agape. He, like everyone else, assumed the worst. They had been identified as a threat. They were being escorted to their doom. Then, a new voice filled the cabin, crackling through the plane's own internal address system. It was clear, calm, and resonant with power. It wasn't coming from a flight attendant's handset. It was being patched in from outside. "Ugly 6, this is Viper 1. We have you on our wing. Your signal is weak, but we read you. Command is on the line. What is your status, sir?" The word "sir" hung in the air, electric. Fuller's hand dropped from Harold's shoulder as if it had been burned. His face, which had been flushed with rage, went bone-white with shock and confusion. He looked from the fighter jet outside the window to the old man in the aisle, his mind unable to process what was happening. The voice from the F-35 pilot Viper 1 came again, this time addressing the entire aircraft. "Civilian aircraft 739er, this is Viper 1 of the United States Air Force. We are responding to a Priority 1 Nightingale distress call from Colonel Harold Lawson. Please cede communication authority to him immediately. I repeat, all flight authority is now deferred to Colonel Lawson." The name echoed through the cabin. Colonel Harold Lawson. The quiet old man in the worn shoes. Viper 1 wasn't finished. His voice took on a tone of deep, almost mythic reverence. For the crew of 739er, the call sign Ugly 6 was retired in 1971. Its last user flew a non-designated airframe over the Ashau Valley, and after suffering catastrophic systems failure, guided his aircraft and his crew home using nothing but a magnetic compass and the watch on his wrist. That man is on your aircraft. I suggest you listen to him. A ripple of understanding, of sheer unadulterated awe spread through the passengers. They looked at Harold, truly seeing him for the first time. They saw not a frail senior citizen but a giant, a living piece of history who had just woken from a long slumber. The young soldier who had helped him snapped to perfect ramrod-straight attention in the middle of the aisle. The student who had tripped Fuller stared, her hand over her mouth. Fuller himself looked like he had been struck by lightning. He staggered back, his own authority not just challenged but utterly annihilated by a power he couldn't comprehend. Harold was no longer a passenger. He was the commander. The radio in Harold's hand crackled again. This time the voice was older, gravelly, and carried the unmistakable weight of command. It was the general from NORAD. "Ugly Six, this is Sun Devil. Good to hear your voice, Colonel." "It's been a while, Sun Devil," Harold replied, his own voice steady, as if he were talking to an old friend over coffee. "We have an avionics fire. Cockpit is unresponsive, presumed lost. We are flying on compromised hydraulics and running fumes on the starboard engine." "Understood, Ugly Six. Vipers 1 and 2 will guide you in. They'll give you the glide path to Green Valley Air National Guard Base. The runway is being foamed as we speak. Can you get to the controls?" "Negative," Harold said. "The door is sealed, but I can talk someone through it. There's a first officer, young, terrified. He needs a calm voice." A new voice, the plane's first officer, stammered over the internal comms, patched through by the fighter jets. "Sir? Colonel Lawson? I can hear you. I don't know what to do." And just like that, Harold went to work. His voice became a calm, precise instrument, cutting through the young pilot's fear. He gave instructions for dumping fuel, for managing the failing engine, for preparing the cabin for a high-speed emergency landing. He was a maestro conducting a symphony of survival. The voice of the general, Sun Devil, came back on the line one last time, his message directed squarely at the air marshal. "Agent Fuller, your service weapon has been flagged. Your credentials have been suspended pending a full review of your conduct. You will offer Colonel Lawson your full and unconditional cooperation. You will not speak unless spoken to. Is that understood?" Fuller could only manage a choked, pathetic nod, his entire career and sense of self collapsing in a single public rebuke. After Harold had guided the first officer through the most critical preparations for landing, he turned to the humbled, broken air marshal. There was no triumph in his eyes, no "I told you so." There was only a quiet sadness. "Fear makes you deaf, son," Harold said softly, his voice barely a whisper. "It's a cage you build for yourself. Courage isn't about not having the cage, it's about finding the key." He glanced down at the old watch on his wrist, its scarred face a testament to a lifetime of finding that key. He saw a flash of fire and twisted metal. He was young again, hanging upside down in the cockpit of a strange bat-winged aircraft that was never supposed to exist. Smoke filled his lungs. His pilot, a man named Jesse, was gone. His navigator, Mike, was bleeding out in the seat beside him. It was Mike who had given him the watch a week before. "For good luck," he'd said. As Mike's life faded, he had grabbed Harold's arm. "They called us the Ugly Six because there were 6 of us, and the bird was ugly as sin," he'd coughed, blood on his lips. "But you get them all home. You're Ugly Six now." Harold had flown that broken, ugly machine back across a border it had no business crossing, navigating by the stars and that watch, carrying the ghosts of his friends with him. The call sign was a burden, a promise, and an honor. A piece of his soul he thought he had buried forever. The landing was violent, a bone-jarring, screeching arrival as the crippled 777 hit the foam-covered runway at Green Valley. But the fuselage held, the landing gear held. Harold's instructions, relayed from the aisle to a terrified first officer he had never met, had been perfect. As the plane slowed to a stop, surrounded by a sea of fire trucks and emergency vehicles, a profound, breathless silence fell over the cabin. Then, someone started to clap. The applause grew, swelling into a thunderous, tearful ovation. It wasn't for the pilot, it was for the old man who had refused to sit down. When the emergency slides deployed and the doors were opened, the first person to come up the steps was not a paramedic, but the 4-star general from the radio. He ignored everyone else, his eyes scanning the cabin until he found Harold. He walked down the aisle, the clapping falling silent once more. He stopped in front of Harold, his back ramrod straight, and rendered a salute so sharp, so precise it seemed to cut the air. "Colonel Lawson," the general said, his voice thick with emotion. "It is an honor, sir." Harold, the unassuming hero, slowly, wearily returned the salute. In the weeks that followed, the story of Flight 739 became a quiet legend. The FAA and the Air Marshal Service launched a joint investigation. Agent Fuller was reassigned to a desk in a basement office pending his forced retirement. A new training module, unofficially called the Lawson Protocol, was developed, designed to teach federal agents and flight crews how to identify and utilize unconventional assets during a crisis, how to look for the quiet competence instead of the loud authority. The airline sent Harold a formal letter of apology and offered him free flights for life. He politely declined. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, Harold was sitting in a small coffee shop near his home, reading a newspaper. The bell above the door chimed, and a man walked in, hesitating just inside the doorway. It was Fuller. He was no longer wearing a suit, just a plain polo shirt and jeans. He looked smaller, diminished. He walked over to Harold's table. "Colonel Lawson," he said, his voice quiet. Harold looked up, his expression neutral. He simply nodded. "I wanted to apologize," Fuller stammered, twisting a napkin in his hands. "What I did, how I treated you, there's no excuse. I was scared, and you were right. I was in a cage. I'm sorry." Harold folded his newspaper and set it on the table. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Sit down, son. Let me buy you a cup of coffee." Fuller sat, and for a long time, the two men just sat there in silence, as the rain washed the world clean outside, a quiet understanding passing between them, a lesson learned, a moment of grace offered and accepted. If this story of unassuming courage moved you, please hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to Veteran Valor for more stories of the heroes who walk among us every day.